Good morning, Bitcoiners. Good morning. That is a super bright sun. So we're good. Bitcoin totally running. All that's left to do is have a coffee, talk about what's new. Good morning, Rickster Swickster. Good morning, Dave. How are you doing? Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, Bud. Good morning, Bud. Bitcoin Graffiti gives us a Nevada. Not an Ohio this morning, it's a Nevada. We get a hey y'all from Kevin Opar and a coffee with bit. There you go. We love the coffee, Bitcoin Graffiti, right? You can drink whatever you'd like, but we love coffee. Morning, 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 PH. Guten Tag, guten Tag. We're going to be talking Germany today, so if there's any Germans around, guten Tag, guten Tag. So, as you know, we always like to start the show with the fakest news we can find. This one's pretty good. We don't usually see Vice in here very often, right? But Vice is contributing this morning to our show. Thank you, Vice. And they let us know that when the balloon came down, this is important news. This is important news. So that's why I'm mentioning it, right? So Vice News yesterday tweeted the following. Meet the ace pilot nicknamed the Black Tom Cruise, who destroyed the China balloon during Black History Month. Amazing. So cool. It's great news. And in case you're wondering, we've spoken about a Guardian writer before named Emma Beddington. So Emma is usually on the lookout for our health. Right? She seems concerned. She's always talking about diet and food, sometimes vaccines, and how we should all get to people who complain, and definitely get a lot of the vegetarian food that she likes, like the vegan stuff. Right? She's really big into the vegan stuff. And here she says this weekend, kind of hoping for this future outcome. What she says is, does the egg shortage spell the end of brunch? For the sake of chickens, she hopes so. So she's hoping, it makes sense. You don't want people to eat if the chickens are going to be unhappy about it. So thanks, Emma, looking after our health and hoping we don't have any more brunches, because that would not be good. That would not be good. So, of course, everyone still talking about the balloon, right? The balloon, what's going on with the balloon. And we've discussed a bunch of ways of looking at it, right? The different frames offered by the different propaganda machines and what's going on with it. But one of the really interesting takeaways that everyone's had is Biden gave one of these press conferences. He doesn't give press conferences. Sometimes reporters are able to grab him before he gets on Air Force One or the helicopter or whatever. So he landed in Air Force One yesterday in Maryland, it says, right? He comes home to Maryland a lot. So he lands, and they asked him, this was a couple days ago, so this is 2 days ago, and they said, balloon, Biden, because everyone was asking, right? No, we don't care about the balloon and what's going on with the trajectory and who sent it and did we shoot it down. We talked about all that framing in the past few days, right? The story to us is the balloon in the news. And I saw on YouTube comments from yesterday's show someone saying, well, the balloon had some steering. Again, if you don't hear from experts, just like in the pipeline case, not in the bag experts, right? Just pipeline engineers, right? We never heard about from pipeline engineers back in the Nord Stream pipeline days. It was all political spin. And again, with the balloon thing, you're not hearing from balloon people. You're hearing from people who have a political slant about the balloon. But accidentally, they did interview some balloon people once. And even though there are propellers and all that stuff, it is still almost impossible to orient these balloons in a accurate trajectory. That's my understanding. I am no balloon expert. But here's what Biden actually said, right? So this is the important part. So forget about whether he shot it down or didn't shoot it down. The balloon's gone. Yeah, the balloon is definitely gone. But here's what happened, right? So they asked him when he got off Air Force One, and they said, what are you going to do about the balloon, man, right? And he said, I told them to shoot it down on Wednesday. They said to me, let's wait till the safest place to do it. And they overruled me. So he said, straight up, the President of the United States said the military overruled him. Now, I'm sure that happens all the time, and it's not out of the ordinary at all, right? The commander in chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, the actual main power given to the President of the United States, right? We forget the toolbox of the President of the United States is actually not that full, right? According to the Constitution. The powers that exist within the presidency are organic, and they grew over time as the president exercised the role and practiced the role to fit the times we lived in. So a lot of our idea of the presidency actually comes from Teddy Roosevelt, who started this leader of the free world system, right? Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president from 1900 to 1908 because of an assassination. He then became president and was reelected one time. He only ran in one election to be president. But he is the person who invented most of what we recognize today as the office of the President of the United States. He's the one who insisted that Hail to the Chief played as he entered a room. That's him. Didn't exist before that, right? So Teddy was the first one to do it. Now his nephew, now if you don't know the history of the Roosevelt family, there are two big branches that came from Holland originally. There was the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, which is Teddy, that's on Long Island, and there was the Hyde Park Roosevelts, which is Franklin, which is up the Hudson River towards Poughkeepsie and all these places. About 200 miles, no, that's a bit too much, 100 miles, I convert kilometers and miles a lot. It's about 100 miles north of New York City, right? And Oyster Bay is only about, let's say, 25 miles east of New York City along the Long Island. So Eleanor Roosevelt, who helped found the UN and all these things, was actually Teddy's niece. She's from the Oyster Bay branch, and she married her extended cousin, Franklin. They were both Roosevelts, right? Eleanor was a Roosevelt before she married Franklin Roosevelt, who became president. And really, he only became president because of her. She remained active in the 1920s. He had had a failed attempt to be the vice president in like 1920, but caught polio in Canada just after that, and he was a cripple for the rest of his life. You know, by the way, here's one of the best ways you can ever frame conspiracy theories or whatever in America. So it was hidden from the American public his entire presidency that he was a cripple. Right? Franklin Roosevelt was entirely crippled and could not walk, but there's only a handful of pictures of him that exist today of Franklin sitting in a wheelchair or being a cripple. No one knew. And you can always imagine that there was, I've seen this meme go around, right? That there was some crazy uncle back in the 30s and 40s who kept saying, boy, I know that man is, I know he's a cripple. And everyone said, oh, shut up, uncle, shut up, uncle, because it was absolutely not the case. Franklin Jr. was a big, strong guy. And Franklin Jr. was his crutch the whole time. So every picture you see, he got very good at hiding it. He would hold on to Franklin's arm, and he was strong enough that he could do those, make it look like he was actually standing. He had braces on his legs. He was never standing, incapable. His legs were totally shot. And he only became president because Eleanor was working all the back rooms in the Democrat Party and doing everything she could to keep his name, current. So he came after. And of course, he is the main architect after his uncle of the way we practice the presidency today, because he was a wartime president and he was elected 5 times, totally unconstitutionally elected 5 times. They changed the rules after him, and from then on, you could only run twice according to the Washington rule. The Washington rule of 2 terms as president was an unwritten rule and was simply an amazing feat of history that Washington decided to go back to civilian life and be a farmer. I'm going to share, because I'm leaving tomorrow. I'll be coming back here, but I can share this story. The hanging right now, weirdly, is George Washington's old house. He lived here in the actual physical building that I am in. It used to be a tourist attraction here in the 1800s. And you can see old tourist brochures. The old timers know what ended up happening was it was one house on a plantation. And there is a George Washington Museum not far. I can walk there. It's very, 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 it's just right up there. And the George Washington Museum, they did a fake news thing. And it was the main guy who owned the plantation's house, but George Washington didn't stay there. He didn't stay at the main house. He stayed in the guest house on the water. And so this is actually, no kidding, I am in the building. I'm in the home that everybody knows as George Washington's house. There's even an old sign when it used to be a tourist attraction downstairs. They changed the story. They changed the story because the other place is a better tourist attraction. The main house, it's up on a hill, it's breezy. There's a horse race track right there, great views, multiple buildings, not just the main house, multiple buildings. But if you'd look at both of his houses, you'd see it's the same architect, it's the same builder, it's the same all that stuff. So I'm literally in George Washington's house, which is amazing. Like, it's the only way. This would be a museum if it was in America. It's only not a museum because the location is split by other houses over time. It was divided before they were able to monetize the whole tourism experience here. But George Washington came here when his brother was sick with tuberculosis. So this used to be like a healing spa area. And that's why he came to spend time with his brother. So Franklin created the role of president, the way we understand it. And then from there, it was practiced in the way that Franklin practiced it in the 1940s, straight through till Obama. And Trump is the first person to completely break the mold of what the president actually is. Now, the new guy breaks it even more. That's why I support Joe Biden 2024. If Fetterman can't make it, right? I'm a Joe Biden 2024 all the way. Just like I was a Donald Trump 2016 all the way, right? I knew that Trump would change the reality of the job because it's an unwritten job, right? So now you get a president, and I'm sure it's common. Presidents are regularly overruled by the military, right? But but do we really believe now that Joe Biden, with his plummeting IQ, I mean, it's just in the tank, right? It never was that high, right? You remember, a vice president is always a lesser person than the president. It's just a normal thing to do. You don't generally choose. The last one who probably made that mistake was McKinley, who led to Teddy Roosevelt, right? It's very rare that the vice president is better or smarter than the president. You wouldn't want to pick that. You'd want to pick someone who wouldn't overshine you, right? Like what's her name? Kamala doesn't really overshine. I mean, she's it's hard to do, but she's a little more nonsensical than Joe Biden with his dementia. Just like the guy that, whatever his name was that Trump picked, right? He was nowhere near the person Trump was. Obama, of course, Biden, right? Biden was nowhere near the person Obama was. So it's normal that VPs are lesser, right? So already he is not quite what we had come from, right? He's already one step below Obama. That's clear. So now he's getting overridden by the military, and it's just that was the excuse. I was overridden, right? Cheney. Well, Cheney's a weird one, right? Cheney's a weird one. So don't know if the logic extends right through. You're right, Daniel. Daniel's saying Cheney. Not. Maybe that's one exception to the rule. But obviously, the Bush Jr. was already just there because of the dad, who was a lesser man than Reagan, right? That's my feeling. Some people said, oh, George Bush Sr. was a war hero and he was the most accomplished person. He was the person that Ronald Reagan, the actor, always played, the American hero. He was a fighter pilot. He was a da-da-da-da-da. I think we know that the daddy Bush was into some nasty business, which we cover here a lot. So I don't have much time or respect for that guy, but I could be wrong. So that's besides the point, though. What we need to focus on here, or what I'm trying to highlight here, is that the way Biden just said, I was overruled. Leave me alone. I can't knock a balloon down. The military said no, right? It sounds exactly like what he said just a few days before, right? People asked him about COVID, right? And he said, what are you going to do about COVID? When are you going to end COVID? And when are you going to, because there's a vote right now in the emergency, the Emergency Measures Act to instill and maintain the pandemic response, right? The COVID mandate, the vaccine mandates to enter the country, right? America is now the only country where you still need a vaccine to enter. And so he extended this to May. And so the media again caught him, right? Biden, when are we going to change the vaccine thing? When's that happening, right? So there are votes in Congress today. But Biden's answer was when the Supreme Court allows it, right? When the Supreme Court allows it. So again, you see the president two times, right? You see two times. And so he said it two times. When people were asking him about the balloon, the military overrode me. Can you end the Emergency Act, right? Which is really a presidential executive order. Make the Supreme Court do it. So put those two things together and you understand why Sticks, Hex, and Hammer and others, including myself, call Biden a steward. Right? Steward as in not a president, not the way we understand the job, not the way the job has been practiced since Teddy Roosevelt straight through, right? It's something else now. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just changed, right? I'm also not saying it's a good thing, but the role has changed, and that's clear. Now, when I look at what we're organizing for Bitcoin 2023, May 18th to 20th, right? We've got, it's not public, but there'll be a leader of a country likely there. And I've already titled the session, The Leader of the Free World, right? The Leader of the Free World. Because it makes you think, is that job, the president, really now still regarded as the leader of the free world? What comes into your mind when you think of Biden? Is it leader of the free world? Is that what comes into your mind? Of course not, right? Even imagining Biden next to the title leader of the free world is kind of funny. Like it makes me laugh. It would make anyone laugh. It just tickles your funny bone. It's absurd. It's the type of absurdity. The reflex of humor. It's a real thing, right? AI is starting to learn it. You can actually codify humor. What humor is more or less the reflex of humor is when you say words that make sense, but offer this meaning that kind of doesn't, right? It's that little quivering between the words make sense and the picture they paint is absurd is what induces laughter, right? There's a few other formulas, but that's one of the main ones, right? That's one of the main things that induces laughter amongst people because the words all make sense, right? Biden, leader of the free world. That sounds like something you would say, right? It used to be presidents were generally just regarded as the leader of the free world. That's the nickname of the president, right? It's POTUS, leader of the free world. President of the United States, POTUS, leader of the free world. When you actually say that now, it's funny, right? It's hilarious. To think of this old doddering guy as the leader of the free world is funny, right? It just provokes your funny bone and says, ha ha ha. Now, put that into the context of all that's going on in the world, right? We see war in Ukraine, energy troubles, inflation, central banking, all this kind of stuff, right? And last night, even worse, we saw one of the greatest tragedies we've seen in a long time in Turkey, right? The body count is looking like it's going to be just atrocious, right? Multiple, looks like 2 7-point something earthquakes, and just calamity all over. Meanwhile, the leader of the free world was busy yesterday encouraging the Grammy Awards, right? So imagine the rest of the world has all these troubles. And what do we have in America? The Grammys are going on last night. You can't reschedule the Grammys, right? You can't reschedule the Grammys, even though no one watches them anymore. But what did we see in the Grammys last night, right? We saw something that was so crazy. You had the Sam Smith performer, full on satanic colors and red. Now it's art. I'm not offended by satanic art, red colors and hell and dragons and beasts and all. That doesn't bother me, right? But what did we have but that piece? So it's not even so much the satanic part, right? Even though the aesthetic was clearly satanic, right? There was clearly a satanic aesthetic to what was going on with this performance yesterday. Red, beast-looking people, right? But as the screen fades from this red, hellish performance, sometimes the advertisement of a sponsor, the logo of a sponsor, can appear over top of a screen as it fades out to the total commercials, right? If you're not from America, you wouldn't believe how much commercialization there is of our normal over-the-air television. But they can even tuck an ad in before they go to the ad time, right? So they did that here, and guess who it was, right? Guess who it was? So it was Pfizer, sponsored by Pfizer. You had this like satanic image sponsored by Pfizer at the same time as you have one of the greatest physical calamities in the world. And the steward, Biden, right, who can't help with the balloon, who can't stop the vaccine mandate, is spending his time watching and congratulating Grammy Award winners while you get this unbelievable trouble, right? So again, his role as steward is becoming more and more obvious to most people. The way the job of president is practiced in the world is no longer what we were used to under Obama, not even close to what we were used to with the presidents that came after World War II, who exercised the role in the way that Franklin Roosevelt had cut it out and created it, right? So now you get a situation where already people are doubting what's coming out of the president, right? You're seeing people constantly saying, the role of the president has, or even just who he is not what we're used to, right? His capacity to explain things, to connect with the public, is just not there, right? Half the population hates his guts, uh, while the other half of the population hates Trump's guts. So you get basically an aggregate of the entire American population who now don't really see much in the president. They might see one in an individual, but it can keep going back and forth, right? You have half who said we had a wasted president and another half who said we had a wasted president. That's two wasted presidents in a row covering more or less 100% of the US population. And while that's going on, right, you've got Biden, who we know has weaponized agencies to go after folks who criticize them. You get this one here where Tucker Carlson was talking about it this weekend, where he actually tried to get the Department of Justice to criminalize memes and satire. And they went after someone from the 2060s, the minute he was elected. Tucker Carlson was talking about this on the show last night. The minute the Biden administration took over, and I don't think this came from Biden himself, right? Again, Steward. This is how bureaucracies end up looking like. They do things that are insane, right? A human wouldn't have made this choice. Political instinct, Joe Biden, if he was all there and acting as the president in the way presidents used to act, probably wouldn't have done this. I'm just guessing, but I'm saying probably wouldn't have done this. But what happened when he took over and you have all these agencies who know they can just say overrule him, tell him to wait for the Supreme Court, right? All these things. Well, the first thing they did is they went after, this is according to Tucker Carlson, they went after someone who created a meme that directed Hillary voters to vote by text instead of going to the voting booths. This guy was from Vermont, like just a little guy from Vermont, right? A little account, had almost no traction. And 5 years after he made the meme, he was arrested, right? Biden administration went after him and said, you're creating political disinformation and you led people to vote by text and they can't do that. Therefore, you created a crime, right? So you get that whole story. And now Tucker made his whole thing yesterday on criminalizing memes and meme culture and all that stuff. And then you get the WHO, right, the World Health Organization, who was heavily involved in the lockdown policies. Obviously, we all know that. I don't have to tell you what WHO did, right? They just released an international pandemic treaty draft that targets misinformation and disinformation. So now the same thing that Biden did to arbitrary assignment of misinformation, disinformation labels on whatever anyone's talking about around vaccine, the WHO wants to now implement that internationally. So whatever Biden did, right, they're going to copy it and create a system where even a person like Biden, who's the president of the United States, is going to have to say, "Oh, the WHO said it," right? I can wait until the Supreme Court overrides it, and if the WHO tells the Supreme Court they can override it, right? That's where this sort of logic is headed, right? Supranational bodies that can start criticizing these things. So now put that, compare that to, and this is the good news for us. This is we get Bud saying it's got to be a simulation. Now they're just taunting us. Well, the good news is, right? There's good news around all of this, which is while all this debate is going on, we have the Twitter files stuff, right? But what's happening at the same time? You get the ordinals thing, right? So just as memes are actually becoming criminal behavior, Bitcoin has a way to do it, right? And if you look at Nostr, it's the same thing, right? Nostr, all of a sudden we have this P2P protocol that will really allow us to avoid most censorship. We saw they did take the Damus app away from the Chinese, but if you notice, the Damus app in Hong Kong is now the number one downloaded social media app in the city, right? Whatever it is. So right away, appetite for this technology is great. in parts of the world where they really Hong Kong. So it's there. I'm not saying it's going to last for a long time. The Apple Store, we all vector, right? It is a choke point. You can do a lot of damage there. It's a party security hole that we notice in banking and policies and all kinds of. We're aware, right? We're aware that we might need another way to distribute such an app, and we'll get there, right? But nevertheless, Bitcoin simulation says has given us the exact tools to not worry too much, right? We can keep on with what we're doing because we've already created an alternative system that will get rid of any of this stuff, worrying about big city, 1 million downloads. Yeah. And it's only, they're saying big city, 1 million plus downloads for Hong Kong. There's only like 8 or 9 million people in Hong Kong. So we're already getting there, right? We're already getting there. So just in terms of misinformation and disinformation, right? We know the Steward is not on our team. He's not there as the leader of the free world. He has already taken sides. And I think most people recognize that. Like, I don't think I have to argue the point, right? I don't think there's any need to go further than it doesn't look like most people think. Most people, many Democrats as well, right, would agree that this guy embodies the leader of the free world title, right? I would say that that's not something that requires too much debate around. But now we find out, right, that, and this is a story that went sort of viral all weekend. It was, if you remember, Netanyahu in Israel was out of office for a little while. He lost an election and another fella came around, Israel Prime Minister Bennett, right? So Bennett gave a podcast this week and he talked about how he had and created a few peace plans at the onset of this war, just previous to the Ukraine-Russia war and in that time period, right? So this has gone sort of viral now. He did this podcast, said it was there. Now everyone is kind of citing it. You get Caitlin Johnstone, who says there's a growing pile of evidence that the West actively sabotaged peace in Ukraine in the first weeks of the conflict, which is an inexcusable and unforgivable thing that should enrage everyone. And it goes on, right? There's our friend David Sachs, right, says the same. Naftali Bennett has no reason to lie. Putin invaded Ukraine to prevent it from joining NATO, and Biden rejected a peace deal that would have prevented Ukraine from joining NATO. This is what the war is really about. It's a war over NATO expansion, is what he says. And then he goes on to say that that's why Kissinger proposed a negotiated settlement in which Ukraine would give up some territory, but the remainder of the country would join NATO. Kissinger understands that NATO expansion is now non-negotiable to the Biden administration. And then David Sachs goes on to say, it's highly ironic that the expansion of a defensive treaty organization would bring the US and Europe to the brink of world war. But this is in fact what's happened. This is known as the security dilemma. The security dilemma is just where as you perpetuate and mobilize peace through strength, that actually you'll create a scenario where because everyone will do the same. It's sort of the lead up to the World War I. So you saw your neighbor collecting guns, and then you saw your other neighbor collecting guns, and you said, well, I got to collect guns too. What if they come for me, right? So that ended up being one of the big takeaways from World War I and World War II. Understood the security dilemma issue, and what Kissinger is basically saying here is we've got to stop this security dilemma in its tracks and prevent further buildup. So David Sachs now, right, also heavily involved in what's going on Twitter, heavily involved in the messaging around peace now. He was one of the only people who was arguing for peace very loudly, unequivocally last year. I don't know if you guys knew this. I just found this out. One of my favorite movies of all time, one of my favorite movies ever, called Thank You for Smoking. You got to see it if you haven't seen it. It's about the original early days of lobbying in DC and just about spin, messaging, how it all works. Aaron Eckhart is the main actor. He was Two-Face in the Christopher Nolan Batman series. So this is around the same time too. It's like sort of mid 2000s. Do you know who financed that movie? I didn't know who produced it. I just found out. Mike Cernovich was talking about it because he watched it again, and I was a big fan. It's one of the few movies that I was able to use to turn folks into, let's say, more small government oriented. Right? I knew a lot of Quebecers that were already in the radical world of being separatists, let's say. But one of the sort of failings of Quebec separatism is that it's very statist, right? They want a communist utopia, basically, or a socialist utopia. So that's why it's been very difficult. The ethnic part and a few other reasons why it's very difficult for Quebecers to sort of push the issue of their sovereignty, because it's sort of uninviting to people who disagree with a really complicated web of policy options. I think Quebec separation will pick up when they just make it about small government and getting rid of the federal entanglements of Canada and all of these things. The Canadian dollar dying will do a lot for this, right? And the let me just see. The separatists that I knew were of that ilk, right? They didn't really buy the socialist thing. And when I showed them this movie, it exploded their brains because it was just this whole new world of spin and things they didn't know. And I've seen that effect on a few folks. That movie was produced by Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, and David Sachs. No idea. An excellent movie. They didn't really get into that much stuff, but right away you could see. Did they produce the movie because they like smoking? Of course not, right? They produced it because it was a great story of how the news is actually created, how the sausage is actually made. Everyone who's mind reading why Elon Musk and David Sachs and these folks bought Twitter need look not too much further for smoking and the production of that film, because that was produced by the PayPal mafia. And when you start looking at what it meant and what they did, and the world was all a collection of psyops at the time. This is before a lot of us understood this. This is almost 20 years ago they made this movie. And here we are thinking about these things, right? And Sachs mentioning again about this right now, involving himself in this stuff, talking about the Neftali Bennett peace treaty. And again, thinking about it in terms of how America can lead the way through this, and it's not going to be. And Wag the Dog is another good one. Yeah, Wag the Dog's great, right? So if we look already, him, Elon, all kinds of folks are attacking this freedom of speech, misinformation, disinformation, psyops argument, and they've been on it for a long time, right? So if you take that, right, and say, okay, the U.S. president is no longer the leader of the free world when it comes to freedom of speech. He's a partisan like any other. Well, let's move from freedom of speech to the money part, right? Follow the money, right? Follow the money. The U.S. dollar, right, of course, was a sign of U.S. hegemony, U.S. influence around the world. It was the main spoil of World War II, right? The petrodollar and the hegemony and monopoly over energy markets that the US dollar was able to institute, with the complete and total control of all sea lanes and all ocean transportation of oil. So that's why there was no other market for oil except for the US dollar for a long time, right? That was the deal. That's how you backed the US dollar as the reserve currency, because all bills were due in US dollar. There was a global demand for US dollars to pay for energy. And now, right now, we look into what's going on with the war, and any follow the money analysis shows that there are numerous American financial interests there, including the Biden family, which Meta, Biota, and all of these things that we've talked about. But after this speech by the president of Israel, let me just find it here. You get, let me just find this one. You get Jack Posobiec, here it is, and Raheem Kassem, right? Jack Posobiec and Raheem Kassem, who had an interview yesterday on one of these, Turning Point USA, one of these internet channels, and they were discussing where this follow the money analysis of the stuff we've talked about, war clandestine, some of the bio stuff that went back to 2005. Here's what they say. The 2008 financial crisis was a result of the Western regime's pursuit of power. As regulation tightened, financial institutions sought less scrutinized places to invest. Remember, we have the financial meltdown, and then more oversight came in. What they argued here, in continuation of what we've seen from the war clandestine, was that institutions sought less scrutinized places to invest, Ukraine being dubbed the most corrupt country in Europe. So it became the most corrupt country in Europe because of US, more or less. And that, I'll just say, for Kraken and looked at different markets, we could see right away that Ukraine had the highest Bitcoin adoption of any European country, but they were 100% closed off from all European banking. You couldn't create a banking rail that would allow money to go back and forth. You needed your own domestic situation. So normally in Europe, you can just create a European euro facility, and you can get all the interact or debit, the ATM lines, and in America we call it ACH, automated clearinghouse, which is what everything plugs into to clear dollars and settle accounts for all the banks. The commercial banks settle with each other, right? And they use the system. So Ukraine was cut off because of corruption. So they're not a part of. They can't issue a debit card that will work anywhere in the world, any of their banks. Like, you can't get a Ukrainian ATM card and then go to Paris. It won't work, right? That's why when Ukraine said, "Oh, we're going to join the EU any day," just last week, and you had the French president saying, "Whoa, chill out, buddy. You're too corrupt. It ain't happening. It's going to take years," right? That's the reason it's going to take years. So you get a follow the money analysis leads us to see that both the dollar, right, and U.S. involvement in Ukraine, not as credible as it once was, right? Now, remember, Bitcoin came about just at the same time, right? Bitcoin came about because of the same conditions. So the US dollar took one route, which was to totally corrupt one place, cut it off from all international banking, which had the side effect of creating more Bitcoiners in Ukraine than any other part of the world, right? So right away, Bitcoin is center stage in this World War III situation, even before it's getting baked, right? Even before it's rising, even before the cake of World War III was rising. So by chance, just by chance, at the same time, right, Bitcoin is created. Ukraine starts on the road to become the most corrupt financially place in Europe, and now we find ourselves where disinformation is leading the way in the war, right? But Bitcoin has the capacity now, with Nostr, with ordinals, to actually combat that, as well as the financial side, and combating all of this business about corruption and where's the money going and who's paying for this war and how did we already give them $20 billion and they're asking for more money in Ukraine. It's still not enough, right? Bitcoin Graffiti asks, do you think Nostr is going to accelerate Bitcoin adoption? Yeah, I do. I think Nostr is one of those things that is teaching people the ins and outs of Bitcoin without them actually having to risk, let's say, custodying Bitcoin. It's like training wheels, I guess you could say. I always thought of Dogecoin as training wheels for Bitcoin in the old days, but this is much, much better because Dogecoin doesn't do that much. And it was a good training wheel thing 5 or 6 years ago, but then the price went stupid and there was no more faucets. I used to tell kids in 2015, 2016, get into Dogecoin, right? Young people who didn't have money for Bitcoin. As I said, learn about it, get the free stuff, trade it into Bitcoin if you can, right? My advice to people for years was get the free stuff and find out how to get Bitcoin for it, right? Anyone who will pay you in some made up coin, eventually you can turn it into Bitcoin if you're smart enough. And so I recommend it to all kinds of people. I think most of them did pretty well. So that's one way. So when you think of the dollar, when you think of Biden, when you think of free speech, right? There's no way this guy can be considered the leader of the free world anymore. There's no way. And now contrast that with this NATO expansion argument that we heard about, right? That the whole thing is really about the expansion of NATO, which is what David Sachs said, right? Well, maybe, but what's happening in the meantime is the following, right? So what is NATO, right? NATO is the European countries, America, Canada. So what's going on in those countries, right? Well, here's what's going on. France, national strike against pension reform, right? Huge strikes this weekend. UK, strike for a pay rise and against an anti-strike law, right? Israel, fifth week of a demonstration against Netanyahu. Denmark, huge protests in Denmark. Why? They abolished a public holiday to raise revenue for the Ukraine war. It didn't go over very well in Denmark, right? At the same time, you get everyone now in the UK mobilizing against the CBDC, which is going to be announced this week, right? So you get England with a ton of trouble, UK with a ton of trouble, France, ton of trouble, right? You get Denmark, ton of trouble, right? It ain't going great in Holland either. I saw the farmers are back at it. All the roads are blocked. The government is moving ahead with its plan to buy out 3,000 farms from the Dutch people, right? It ain't going to work. I saw one of the fertilizer distributors, the shit cannons, right? I saw a shit cannon hitting all the police again. That was a beautiful image, right? I love when they shoot the shit cannons in Europe at the cops. It's amazing, right? But that's not all the bad news, right? There's one more bad news story, but it could be a good news story. But Switzerland, right, now making cash transactions a constitutional right. So no matter what, Switzerland is going to keep the push transaction, not that you need an account and all that stuff, right? So Switzerland, again, getting it right, right? How many times does Switzerland have to get it right with their amazing federated? So there's no leader of Switzerland. There's never been a leader of Switzerland, right? You know that. Switzerland does a thing where the states, the cantons, right? They're called cantons. They each have like a governor, and then the governor just takes turns, right? The governor, but there's no permanent leader whatsoever. There never has been. If any of you have ever seen the movie The Third Man, old movie about set in Vienna during the end of World War II when it was split between Russia, America, England, and France, and Orson Welles was a character running watered down penicillin, leading to a bunch of kids dying and all that stuff. And he was having obviously a form of cognitive dissonance when it's all one of these American lost abroad stories. So American goes to find his friend, and typical movie of the time, a typical trope is the American who goes to Europe and everyone's too clever and they lie too much and they're too sophisticated, and he's an aw shucks guy. But they really twisted it there, because the aw shucks guy finally does meet his old friend who he thought was dead, right? This Orson Welles character. And the Orson Welles character, starts to explain to him what he did, right? Yeah, I've been selling watered down penicillin profit. I don't care if people are dying. And the American is sort of shocked. He said, "How can you do this, right? How can you be an American and do these things?" And his answer was one of the greatest speeches in the history of cinema. So go listen to the soundtrack, the zither, right? That's a amazing instrument. It's a great soundtrack. And the speech is one of the most famous speeches in the history of film. And Orson Welles says to him, under the Borgias, for 50 years, they had, terrible oppression, and it was the worst, and all kinds of people were killed and tortured. And then what did they produce? The Italian Renaissance, he says. Switzerland, what did they have? For 500 years of democracy, what have they produced? The cuckoo clock. And it's a great speech, the cuckoo clock. But the inventors of the cuckoo clock got it right again, right? So never underestimate how right the Swits get it without trying to think too much on these things, right? But it's not all of it. Glenn Greenwald has given us one of the best insights into a major change in NATO stability and in what could happen shortly with Ukraine. It can go either way. I don't know the answer here, right? But this breakdown of what's going on in Germany and the local politics and what the implications are is, I think, really important. And it's going to become more important as we go forward, because this could make or break everything that's going on, right? So here's what he says. Glenn Greenwald says, "Can't recommend enough reading Fisted Foucault's Saturday's Week in Review, an invariably smart and informed tonic to Western state media propaganda. Today, on the incomparably dangerous German Green Party and the now diverging interests of US and Kiev." Very interesting stuff. "The leftist German Greens using ID politics are now the EU's most fanatically militaristic and eagerly subservient to US NATO party. Germany is increasingly criminalizing speech to ban dissent to NATO EU dogma. So the interesting thing about this is that the environmental people, right, who want to, 15-minute cities, how's Greta feeling, what's going on with the end of the world that's coming in a day, all these people are now the most militaristic because obviously they're being offered all the control, all the power they would ever need to realize their what they think are healthy prescriptions for Earth, maybe just healthy prescriptions for their anxieties. So he goes on. And the above article also examines a new RAND study warning the costs to the US from endless war in Ukraine are now outweighing the benefits. I know many Americans believe the US is fighting for democracy there, but as always for US wars, that's not the goal. The war on terror / Iraq showed how potent U.S. media propaganda is. With big tech monopolies, it's greater now. Russiagate, COVID, and Ukraine are vivid illustrations. They got millions of Americans who never heard of Ukraine to hang flags on their homes and arm Nazi battalions. As the RAND study notes, the problem for Washington is that the propaganda almost worked too well. They whipped up so many Americans into a neocon frenzy. We're waging war to vanquish the bad guys, that many Americans now won't accept anything less than full Ukraine victory. Years ago, the most despotic countries, UAE, Egypt, Saudis, Philippines, criminalized fake news. The democratic world is now doing the same. The US security state protects big tech concentration because with censorship, it provides unprecedented propaganda power. Two things that have never worked out well for the world. One, German militarization, and two, German censorship of anti-war sentiment. Even Germans feared both. Overnight, mainstream Germans demand them. Russian tanks are now headed to the Russian border. Now, remember what German tanks headed to the Russian border will sound like to the Russians. This is big. It's big, right? As Chomsky often noted, credentialism is so vital for Western centers of power because it creates a class of seemingly neutral scholars who, due to their unique comforts, are the most vested of all in perpetuating status quo power and orthodoxies. There are few things people love more than cheering a war from a safe distance. As Adam Smith warned, it's exciting and gives a feeling of purpose and strength. But it's getting harder and harder for Zelensky to keep his conscript army willing to die. Indeed. So what's going on is, and this is where the beauty of the simulation becomes apparent, right? We clearly have an information war. Twitter is enough to get us started fighting the propaganda war and the meme war, but they're already going to make this stuff illegal on the other platforms. It doesn't look like that's going to stop, or at least the appetite for it to stop is not really there. Right. So when we see the ordinals and the Bitcoin thing and people arguing about whether or not it's good, here's what I know. Right. And it comes from, now I'll go back, someone asked me to talk about the ordinals. That's why I've saved it to the end. I think it's important when we consider all this, right? Bitcoin graffiti, ask Noster here. I'm going to put ordinals and Noster into the same boat, right? It's in the same boat. Now go back in time. Right, I mentioned this before. The whole debate around the fork had nothing to do with the block size. That was fake. The block size doesn't matter. It's arbitrary. It's irrelevant, right? The actual debate was whether the Silicon Valley commercial Bitcoin interests could force a hard fork that had unknown security consequences. Unknown. We didn't know them, right? And it was them strapping on the fail fast, break things, consumer tech mindset of Silicon Valley and trying to run it into Bitcoin. Block size was not the fight. The fight was between the corporate interests that wanted Bitcoin to perform better as a consumer technology and the user activated soft fork element that added a dimension to the fight about what small people could do without the influence of corporations, commercial interests, and other things. And that was the fight. The block size was not, there wasn't a right number. It wasn't like this is the right number for Bitcoin and nothing else can be different. It had nothing to do with that. The fight was about whether you can force your nodes to upgrade or not upgrade, right? That if you can force a node to do what some political body said, well, that's an attack vector. And the UASF people, right? That's what it was. They wore the United States Air Force hats and just changed the order of the letters, right? It was the user activated soft fork movement, very popular in the summer of 2017. But they were not arguing a scientific engineering, this is the right block size and nothing else. Some were, but that wasn't really the point, right? The point was about who's in control and are these commercial interests disproportionately powerful within the network, right? And are they going to force us to risk something we don't necessarily understand or want to risk? And Bitcoin Pierre Rochard, who I worked with at Kraken, who I've known for a long time, I think put it best, right? He summed it all up. Let me find the quote I have from him. And I'll tie this into Noster in a second as well. So here's what he says. And he called it No 2X, UASF, right? Similar. No 2X proved that miners and businesses don't control Bitcoin. UASF proved that developers don't control Bitcoin. Ordinals and inscription prove that Bitcoin maxis don't control Bitcoin. Bitcoin is proven decentralized. There really is no second best, right? So look, if the transactions are valid, right, it's okay. Now, I still don't know what the right number is for the block size, and people are saying the bloat is a problem down the line. We don't have to suppress that point of view either, right? The point is we're able to argue this in a way that no one else is able to argue anything. Is anyone else getting a straight argument over on Germany and their economy with Ukraine? Is that happening? Just one second. So there isn't a right answer, right? But at least Bitcoiners can argue it without using psyops, without using suppression of speech, right? We're actually showing the world how to disagree, have a normal argument, right? And this isn't one where you're absorbing some spin from someone else. Now, I understand why you can get confused in all of this stuff. It's not easy, right? It's not an easy debate. What was the right answer before, given a new question, might not be the right answer this time. But it's happening, and the blocks are being found valid. No one had to go and do all this stuff, right? So ordinals are part of this. Now, things could change going forward. We might see there's a problem, right? We might see the bloat issue, right? We might see the bloat issue, but there's also a capacity to change the hardware that's participating in the network. I understand people are worried about archival nodes, right? But guess what our real problem is? Our real problem is debates. Our real problem is misinformation. The debate about a blockchain bloat, I'm sorry, does not compare to what I just heard about someone getting arrested in America for disinformation around elections from something they did 5 years before. It's about all this other stuff that we see in suppression of debate that David Sachs is bringing up. It's the spin they mentioned in Thank You for Spoking, right? These are the issues. So if Bitcoin now all of a sudden has tools, right, to fight the disinformation campaign, it's a good thing. It can't not be a good thing. And they're trying, the forces that don't want us to debate about the vaccines, that don't want us to debate about the war, that are trying to spin it so that the debate is neutralized, right? They're also trying to ban memes. And that we have now created, I think people are freaking out. There's a meme that someone's sold for, one Satoshi was sold for like 13 Bitcoin or whatever it was. Well, speech is also valuable, right? And if there are people out there willing to pay that, who are we to say, right? Who are we to say? Eventually, the miners would love the revenue source, and I think it's going to take care of a lot of problems. Now, you get a bunch of Ethereum people come in, oh, the Bitcoin maxis are crying because the precious block space is being used, and da-da-da-da. They're not really seeing the point. The point is we're able to have this debate inside of Bitcoin in a way that's actually logical, right? This is not just spin. People are saying, well, block size, you can be wrong, right? You can be wrong. But the argument isn't triggering a bunch of cognitive dissonance. It's not a bunch of broken brains arguing about things that aren't even real in the first place, right? This isn't shoot the balloon down or you're controlled by China, right? Which are two fake spins. They're not real, either of them, right? And at least in Bitcoin, with the ordinals debate and with what's going on, well, Nostra, of course, is not part of it, but nevertheless, the debate around what's being used, put onto the blocks in ordinals, I think right, fits into this argument that just like we saw the financial calamity of Ukraine began in 2008 and Bitcoin came into the mix, that's the financial part, right? World War III is a financial, economic, and psychological war. And so we get the economic part taken care of with Bitcoin because it links directly into what Ukraine was used for at the same time that the global financial system changed in '08. So simultaneous to that, Bitcoin is arming itself to combat on the psychological battlefront and now has the tools that will allow it to proliferate in Hong Kong or on chain, right? So I think we're going to win. I think we're there, right? Everything's there. It will be harder to decentralize, though. More memory needed to download the blockchain. I'm not worried about that. I mean, Satoshi was very clear that Moore's law was involved in his projections for Bitcoin going forward. And this argument is neutralized by Moore's law, as far as I can tell. I could be wrong, but I think this argument with Moore's law is now. I understand archival nodes, and people are crying, "Oh, it's hard to run my archival node." Yeah, there's going to be some adjustment. This is a change, but I don't think it's going to stop. I think the filters and stuff are fine for people to use, but we're there. Moore's law hasn't broken yet. We know when it will break down, though. And what you're talking about, Bitcoin Graffiti, is the outer limit of Moore's law, the cutting edge of Moore's law. And that we know is going to end. But the stuff we get commercially is still on a lag from Moore's law. The Moore's law applies to supercomputers and then the overall computation power on Earth, right? So it's not just the overall speed of a microchip, which Moore's law affects, it's also the total computation power on Earth. And so the reason why the total computation power on Earth doubles is because the new commercial generation of chips are that much more powerful than the ones that came before. So the commercial chip piece, I think, has more one way because there's a lag on the supercomputer argument at Moore's law. So we know that there's an end to Moore's law at the cutting edge, right? And it's caused by the physical size of the atoms, right? It's literally butting up against atomic scales, and that's why it can't get any more efficient. Because literally the huge size of the electron in silicon is in the way, and it's a larger atom than others, and that's why they know it's not. And then of course mathematically you can determine what chips are going to have trouble, but we're nowhere near that, is my understanding. We still have a lot of runway to go. So once they still make massive computers, right? The supercomputers are large. The one they had left outside in what was it, Ecuador from China, it's a big building. So it's those that continue to shrink, right? So we're not even commercially at that point yet. So, but I don't know the details. I'm not a Moore's law expert, but that's my understanding, right? That's my understanding. So commercially, we're fine. I think Moore's law will continue for quite a while. And I mean, when I say commercially, I mean even the Raspberry Pi level, right? We should pull up a chart for dollars to terabytes because that's what counts, right? Individuals should be able to keep on running. Yeah, that is what counts. That is what counts. Yeah. But again, I could be wrong to not worry about this stuff, but I think it's going to get solved. So, and to me, the more important part was the maxis having control, even social control over Bitcoin. It is dangerous. It's dangerous, right? Because maxis don't have all the right answers. They don't, right? I am fond of and friends with some of the maxis, right? That ever were the most toxic going. Who I love. I love these guys, right? They're the best. But they might not be right. I don't think they argue they're right. I think that they have taken this approach, maybe, but it's not even uniform amongst them. This is divided maxis, right? Which is a good thing. I think I have a quote about that here. Let me just see. I think I took two quotes here. Let me see the other one. Oh yeah, this one other piece of fake news I wanted to share with you guys because it's really funny. All these stories now about here it is. Pierre is correct that the ordinals have achieved something that was previously thought implausible. Um, Rodamer, that's the guy who created ordinals, has provoked a rift within maxi ranks on a scale never seen before. While not without risks, it's expected evolutionary step and further cements Bitcoin's decentralization. That's how I feel about it. That's how I feel about it, right? It further cements the decentralization because the social pressures amongst maxis are real, and we've seen how it can attack ideas, and that's not a bad thing either. We're not here to clutch our pearls. I don't have any problem with maxis saying exactly what they think and fighting for it, right? But again, the difference, and I think the good thing about what's happening with ordinals is look how we're debating it, right? There's a fight, but you're not seeing the type of sinister psyops. You're not seeing what goes into spin. You're actually just seeing a debate for the whole world about how it should actually happen. We're not here to make unanimous friends with everybody, right? Inside of Bitcoin, it is an adversarial environment. It's an adversarial. It always was an adversarial network, right? We're not pushing democracy on anyone. This is not what's happening, right? Bitcoin is not democratic. It's not. It never was, right? Remember, it's a peer-to-peer network, right? Who are the other peers in the world? You know where the word peer comes from? It comes from England. The lords are peers only amongst each other. The commoners in the House of Commons, our Congress, are not peers. They're just commoners. Right? So, not trying to say you're just a commoner if you don't do this, but it's true, right? In Bitcoin, running a node means you are a full-fledged peer. You can rent space, if you will, right? If you pay for someone else to hold your Bitcoin and pay for their version of the chain, right? Or trust their version of the chain. These are real people too, but they're not peers. They're not exactly peers. And then it's not what it is. A peer in a Bitcoin network is not the guy who buys a cup of coffee with Bitcoin, right? That's not enough. Now, I don't think everyone in the world has to be a peer. That's not the case. Enough of them do, and we'll always get more, right? So it'll grow. All right, team. That's what I got for today. That's what I got. No board today. A little slow. So let me know what you think, guys. Like, subscribe, add some comments onto the page, right? Add some comments onto the page. Friend and foe alike on the same network. That's why I stack as many as I. Good show. Finally caught one live. Great downtown music. Yeah, it's look. I don't have the answers on ordinals and Noster. What I like is the fight. Right? I like the fight, and I think whatever technical thing can be done, I wouldn't be for it. Right? I wouldn't be for it. I'm all into not changing the protocol. I'm a what's it called again? The gold that Talib invented. Really famous for remembering it. Sometimes Bitcoiners forget what is meant when we ourselves say you're not ready for what's to come. The likely price targets of 1 to 1 will probably happen. Even normies agree. Yeah, I think it's inevitable now, right? I think it's inevitable. Reteaching Bitcoin what real democracy and free markets look like is different. It's not always present, but Bitcoin is showing us what it looks like. Yeah, so I get that's what I'm saying. I love the debate around the ordinals. This is how debate should happen in politics. Not the Joe Biden way, not the, run a disinformation campaign, right? No. Can't wait to share something. I would love it. Yeah, awesome, man. Love it. Love the show today, brother. All right. Peace, team. See you soon. See you tomorrow.